Neil Bush is the son of late former U.S. President George H.W. Bush and is founder and chairman of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. He accompanied his father to China twice in the past and currently stands in opposition to those in America who advocate an adversarial relationship between the two countries. Instead, he argues there has been tremendous mutual benefit in the past, and we should strive for better mutual understanding now. So, in his view, where are China-U.S. relations headed, and how can common ground be better recognized and appreciated? And what should both countries do to help build a peaceful and prosperous world that benefits all? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Neil Bush. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Neil. You delivered a very important speech at one of the important forums in Hong Kong regarding bilateral relationship, which you believe is the most important one in the 21st century. And you called for all players to go back to the normal track of the engagement that your father and brother did for the past decades. Now, what do you mean by going back to the normal track, the style of your father and brother?
First of all, I didn't create this notion that the U.S. China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship. My dad, throughout his entire illustrious political and diplomatic career, has always said that as China rises, the United States and China's relationship will have more impact and kind of relevance to the world than any other bilateral relationship. So I'm basically following in my father's footsteps. My father had a style of leadership which basically was a reflection of his values. My father's values were be humble, be respectful, look for the best in others. He had core values. He felt that personal relationships can make a difference in the relationship between individuals, but also between nations. And during my father's presidency, there were plenty of examples of like building the coalition to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, where he implemented his policies through that lens and through that context. And so the George H.W. Bush style of leadership would be one where you have deeper engagement, where you have more dialogue, where you put yourself in the shoes of the other guy, and where you don't make assumptions, you don't create perceptions, but where you deal with the realities, and you deal with them in a respectful, thoughtful way. And there are clearly huge challenges that the U.S. and China face, like all bilateral relationships. Not everything is perfect, but I do argue that if you could do it in the way of my father, former President George H.W. Bush, that this world would be a lot more tranquil and there'd be a lot more peace and harmony, and that we'd be moving closer and closer to collaboration and not confrontation.
Of course, the reality is a better teacher than stereotyped perceptions for the current United States, which is so divided on many issues.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to build consensus across the aisle for re-engaging China. But China does pay tribute to a late father. I'm sorry that our heads of state didn't show up at the state funeral. However, what do you think of the funeral itself that took place at the end of last year?
First of all, just to get to your point about the divisiveness in the United States, one of the things that's sadly uniting Republicans and Democrats is kind of a growing anti-China sentiment, and we can talk about that later. The funeral proceedings were amazing. My brother George kind of led our family. Jeb, Marvin, Daru, and I, and all of our families were together from Houston to Washington, back to Texas, and to hear the tributes that were paid to Dad, both on television and at these ceremonies, was just so moving. And people, I think, felt that I was going to be grieving, or that we were all going to be, terribly sad. But the fact that Dad lived to be 94 years old, that he lived an amazing life, largely in service to others, but as an unconditionally loving father, he set such a great example for how we could all live our lives in a better way. And so, and I happened to be blessed because I lived across the street from my parents. So as my mom got old, and as Dad got old, I was there every day that I was in town. I'd read books to them and have a drink with my dad and, you know, be with them by their side. And I saw Dad slipping away, and he couldn't hang on anymore. And it was kind of a remarkable thing to witness, and it was a real blessing, you know, for me as a son to be there with him that so often and so meaningfully during the end of his life.
Talking about the message you hammered home in the speech that you delivered in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, you called for people to speak up, to break the silence in re-engaging China. But how difficult will the job be given the adversity of the current situation?
First of all, I think it's critically important that companies or individuals that know China well and that understand the importance of this relationship find their voice and not just take the propaganda that we hear from the loudest speaker, President Trump, who's saying all these negative things about China. So corporations, for example, who President Trump recently ordered to leave China, which obviously it's a joke. There's no way that's going to happen. But where are those corporations that are benefiting from access to the Chinese market? Why aren't they speaking out? Why aren't they, you know, kind of ringing the bells from the highest hill to say that this relationship is vital and that the anti-China sentiment has gone too far, that we need to bring balance back to the conversation? So yeah, I do call for people to find their voice. And interestingly, right before the Hong Kong speech, there were about 100 China experts or China stakeholders, U.S. stakeholders having a stake in China, who signed a letter that was saying that China is not an enemy, it doesn't represent an existential threat to our national security or to our economy. There are key issues that we need to address, and we need to address them in a serious and effective way. So there are people finding their voices. And I'm going to use the Bush Foundation, by the way, as long as I can, to try to be that alternative voice, because too many people in America are believing things and hearing things about China that I know are just not true.
You know, most Chinese would appreciate the noble job you do for improving the bilateral relationship. However, some of your family members may hold a different view about your use of the family name Bush for the foundation. Is that a natural response from, for example, former President George W. Bush?
My brother George is not, you know, entirely opposed to my using this platform for this purpose. He's raised questions with me in private about it. My brother Jeb, on the other hand, has a much stronger feeling and is concerned about China's rise, like many people in the United States. And so we've had a great discussion, you know, on the phone and via email. We keep sending each other articles, you know, and that kind of thing. I'm trying to convince him that China's rise is actually great for those people who are now enjoying freedoms that were unimaginable 44 years ago when I first came to China during the Cultural Revolution. And so, yeah, we probably have a pretty typical family. My mom used to hate it when we'd have, you know, maybe drink at dinner and stuff and then start getting into political discussions, because I'm kind of a maverick on certain things and my brother's, you know, more traditional, and so we'd get pretty heated and have a lot of fun.
That's a very good story about the family. I believe that the first family, the former first family, must be a very good story for writing a book. Right? Trade negotiations between the two economies have been going through ups and downs with the tariffs being levied back and forth. Is it an easy job to get all of American multinationals back and out of Chinese market?
Obviously, it's not going to happen. It's a stupid notion.
But he was citing the 1977 National Emergency Act.
I mean, he's also cited President McKinley, who back at the turn of the century used tariffs, you know, as a weapon for promoting U.S. interests abroad. And he says that the U.S. government received all these, you know, not billions, back in the day, you know, millions or $100,000 of benefit from it. And he's trying to apply that little bit of history to today, and it's just not right. The tariffs are not, first of all, they're damaging long-term you know, supply channels and that kind of thing. I was in Maine last week, where we have a family compound. So all my siblings were together for a vacation. I met a lobster man. So Maine is famous for amazing lobsters, many of which are shipped to China or have been shipped to China. This guy that I talked to said that with global warming, it's harder to catch lobsters in Maine. But now with the 25% tariff, they can't. They're no longer competitive. So they're really being squeezed. And this policy of using tariffs to bash countries, not just China. He's used tariffs, you know, in Europe and all over the place. Frankly, I feel like it's the one tool he's found that he can wield without getting any approval from Congress. And so because he has this style of negotiation that's very confrontational, you know, it's the one thing in his satchel that he can pull out and use. Frankly, Ray, I do believe that there is some chance, hopefully before the election, that he'll want to win so bad that he'll start making compromises, and that a deal will be struck. And if a deal is struck, you know, where there's, you know, access to both markets, U.S. and China, you know, where all the things are negotiating in terms of intellectual, you know, property theft and those kinds of things are addressed in a serious way, it's going to be a huge benefit to China. It's going to be a huge benefit to the United States. We'll be back on track to establish that this globalization, the relationship between the United States and China economically, has benefited both countries hugely over the last 40 years since normalization of relations. And there's no reason we shouldn't keep that going. And you know, it'd be awesome if President Trump were able to achieve that. The problem is he has people in his White House that want to see China fail.
But it's not fighting alone. I mean, many of his nasty views about China are shared by people across the aisle in the D.C. And he accused China of stealing American jobs, stealing American intellectual property. He says the trade deficit, a huge trade deficit in favor of China means the devastation of American economy.
I mean, it's so stupid. Ray, on that last point, you know, he brags about and should be campaigning on the fact that we have a strong economy. Before the tariffs, the United States was at full employment. Our economy was ginning along. Then he you know, throws tax cuts out there to make it even a stronger economy. The fact is, jobs weren't being stolen. Most of the jobs that are lost, as I understand it, are from technological advances, the automation processes, so the workers
in the Rust Belt.
In the Rust Belt, and so that's just natural. That's a natural evolution. In the meantime, there are so many new jobs that have been created in the United States that we're at full employment today. And the tariffs are not doing anything to help create more jobs in the United States. In fact, I'm pretty sure you're going to see that a potential recession that we enter into will be caused by tariffs.
Thank you so much. You're watching Dialogue, our exclusive interview with Mr. Neil Bush, son of late and former U.S. President George H.W. Bush. He's also founder and chairman of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. After this break, we'll be back and continue our discussion about U.S. China relations and what kind of legacy should we enjoy from the Bush family. Stay with us. What are the challenges in the trade negotiations? Because trade talk is likely to be resumed in early September, despite the anger of the presidential tweets, one after another. He was so angry about China's decision to retaliate in proportion. So what do you think?
I don't know. If I were the Chinese side, I'd be perplexed. President Macron from France at the G7 meeting made the appropriate comment that the policies that are being pursued are creating uncertainty. And he didn't specifically point out that, the uncertainty that's created by the erratic behavior of this White House is something that really should be concerning to everyone. And I just hope that the trade war is stopped, that the tariffs come down, that we resume trade back and forth between the United States and China, that we enjoy the great benefits that for the past 40 years have created unprecedented success in the U.S. economic development. Our per capita GDP has risen very rapidly. The Chinese have gone from, basically being in poverty back in the beginning of the relationship with the U.S. to now they're the second largest economy in the world, and will someday, not in the too distant future, be the largest economy in the world. It's inevitable, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Oh, by the way, we have to go back to the very beginning of the PRC in the late 1940s when our lifespan was only 40-something. Now it's one small step short of 80.
Yeah.
Lifespan has improved remarkably instead of GDP growth. By the way, there might be a big problem obsessively concerning GDP growth. What about the construction of soft power? What are your suggestions for the building of China's soft power? We have our traditional Chinese culture, but I'm afraid that most Americans have been left puzzled as to what is the strength of the Chinese governance.
Right, right. I think it's really interesting because the Thucydides trap model, you know, projects that a rising power represents a threat to the existing power, and that inevitably they're going to end up in a clash. And the Chinese system for using soft power overseas through the Thousand Talents program, through the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, through their outreach, economic outreach in various countries, is something that is perplexing, I think, to most Americans who don't really understand, is this a nefarious way for China to get into the, you know, to take control over and to
change the world order that was built by the United States in the wake of the Second World War?
Yeah, to change the world order. And I think the world has changed so much in recent years, specifically through the connectivity, through technology, through the internet, through, you know, the world is becoming, you wouldn't know it by watching all
Is it true that people like Donald Trump refuse to recognize the rise of China? They simply can't recognize the rise of China, and certainly they would mitigate the impact of China.
Yeah, I think it's a few people. I think Donald Trump doesn't. I mean, I hate to say this, but I don't think he has a real strong and deep knowledge of foreign policy of other countries, cultures, etc.
But he's proud of being a deal maker.
I know, but he does have people around him who are pulling and pushing. He's got people that are more moderate. He's got people that are really hawkish.
You don't think there's a single voice? There's a united voice in his administration?
No, of course not.
China?
Are you kidding? Can you imagine working for the guy and he's like one day calling President Xi a great friend, the next day he's an enemy, and they're probably just, you know, scratching their heads and say, "Oh, go, what is he, an enemy or is he a great friend?" I mean, what? I mean, he says anything that comes to his mind, and unfortunately, his mind is a little, you know, a little off, frankly, and I hate to say that about our president.
Well, he also called President Xi one of his great friends.
I know. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, so anyway, I do think, though, that he leans towards doing the right thing. So, for example, I don't think he really would pull the trigger to engage China in a military conflict. I think, having said that, his rhetoric is so harsh and so divisive and is misleading so many of the American population. And it's not just him. You were right. Democrats and Republicans are kind of piling on China right now. Every time there's an election that comes up, everyone beats up China in order to get more votes. Whoever can bash China the most is going to get, they feel like they're going to get more votes. So this presidential election is going to be pretty ugly for China, frankly. And it's sad to me, because if people had come to China, if they had seen the rise of the freedoms that people are enjoying, of the per capita income that people are enjoying, of the amazing development that's taking place in China, they'd have it, and if they experienced the friendship and the natural kindness and gift giving of the Chinese people, they would have an entirely different perspective. So unfortunately, people are, you know, too easily misled.
You know, Neil, many Chinese people like me feel increasingly confused about voices that we have heard from the United States. For example, if you talk to politicians and about ideology, you're going to have an explosion of anger. But if you talk to the business community, most of them would see the stakes in Chinese market justifiable, and they would love this business relationship to be sustained. Look at the negative response to his anger about China from the stock market. I mean, nosedive, in fact, by 7 points. That's a lot.
It's amazing.
So do you think that's something that's brought President Trump to the negotiating table instead of the phone calls that the Chinese government said, no, we didn't have any phone calls. We didn't give a public statement.
Yeah, it's hard to know what's true when he speaks. And again, I'm sorry to say that about our president, because I hold out higher hopes. I was raised by a guy who was president. I've admired my brother who was president, and I think they set a great example for how to serve with humility and with honor and integrity, and not to mislead and not to lie and not to manipulate, not to bully. But we've got a different style. Hopefully it won't be a style that is sustained in the United States. When Richard Nixon was impeached and when he left office, Jimmy Carter came and filled the void. So he went from what a guy was perceived to be lacking of morals, and in came an evangelical Christian. Well, maybe in the backwash of Trump, whenever that happens, there's going to be kind of a shift back to civility.
This year sees the 40th anniversary of the founding of the, or normalization of
Yes.
the U.S. China relationship, but it seems that there won't be any serious celebration or commemoration in your country. But what would you do as chairman of the U.S. China Relations Foundation to pay tribute to President Jimmy Carter, who's still alive?
Well, I'm doing two things. One, in June, we honored President Carter with the very first George H.W. Bush Statesmanship Award for U.S. China Relations. He deserves it. Actually, when he first engaged China as a post-president, he was, I think, pretty skeptical and negative about it, but he over time became, much more aware, being in China often, and was a big advocate for respectful dialogue between the United States and China, very deserving of that recognition. Secondly, we're having another conference. The Bush Foundation, Bush China Foundation, evolved out of a conference my dad co-hosted with Madam Li Xiaolin. Starting in 2003, he participated in 5 conferences, bringing Chinese and U.S. stakeholders who care about the relationship together for dialogue. And so we're having our 7th conference in October 28th, 29th in Houston, Texas. And we're having it, the theme of it's going to be the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China ties, looking back, analyzing the current status of the relationship, and looking forward and bringing in experts and having different views represented, but having an open, respectful dialogue that hopefully will reflect the kind of engagement that China and the United States ought to have in perpetuity, just every single day. There should be conversations and
There's no question, Neil, that you are a friendly ambassador who hopes that the current silence will be broken. People need to speak up. However, when you say a major conference is to be held in Houston, Texas, to commemorate the 40th anniversary, what do you think of the issue of representation? Because many American China hands would be afraid of being regarded as panda hugger. They refuse to show up. Don't you think this is
I guarantee you that we will have non-panda huggers coming to our conference. And it'd be fun. What I would love is to have the China antagonists, or the people that are skeptical of China's rise, sitting on the same stage, with panda huggers, to use your expression. And then have an
It's not my expression, but it's
I know, I've heard it before.
A phrase coined by the Americans.
I have a feeling if you search...
As opposed to blue team.
If you search the social media in the United States after my speech was reported back there, I'm pretty sure panda huggers was the nicest thing many people said about me. There were probably many vile things that were said. Because
Robert Zoellick, a former undersecretary and the former president of the World Bank, was also accused of being a panda hugger when he only stayed in China for 2 days. He chose one of the 2 days to visit a panda in Chengdu.
Yes.
To give, to take a look at this cute, lovely animal.
Yes.
But this is unbelievable.
Yeah, it is crazy. Things have gotten out of hand.
It's difficult to iron out differences between the two camps, those who called for a constructive relationship with China and those who say loud and clear, we should disengage China, we should decouple the Chinese market, we should have a process of deglobalization so that America would always be taken as the first and foremost, most important ahead of everything else.
Yeah. So Ray, I agree with your basic assessment that it appears to be difficult to imagine that. But if you had a president who led and who advocated for closer ties and deeper dialogue and more respectful relations and cooperation down the road, then that president could have an influence over the thought process of the people who elect our representatives. Right now, our representatives feel like it's easier and better and politically it's simpler to bash China. But if you had presidential leadership and if you had other popular people who are on the know, come out with and find their voice and say, look, we really shouldn't try to turn China into an enemy. There's nothing that suggests in China's history that they're a warlike nation. You know,
we are very different from the former Soviet Union, which was called by Ronald Reagan evil empire.
Evil empire, right. Totally different.
We don't have any military alliance. We don't have any ideology that goes against the West, what Western stand for.
So the issue, though, that does create a warlike sentiment are the economic issues. So cyber thefts, you know, intellectual property theft. So companies, and I know for a fact that this is a giant concern of our FBI and our law enforcement agencies, and I'm kind of curious to see, you know, when the law enforcement agencies are going to actually reveal these, you know, all these thefts and stuff. But there is clearly a concern about intellectual property theft, and we need to address that. There's concern about, you know, research that's being done in the United States. In fact, I think it's become hysterical. I think it's become, like, you know, way too much. But at MD Anderson in Houston, Texas, where I live, it's a cancer research and cancer patient, you know, hospital. There were Chinese researchers who've been there for many years, who have been accused of wrongdoing with their relationship with China and have actually been removed from their research, you know, activities, and it's gone overboard. There may be evidence that there's a connectivity back between some of those folks, not just at MD Anderson but in others in China. But the fact is, research that's being done is an iterative process. You do the research, you publish your paper. You do it in Houston and New York and China, everywhere, and it's all about finding a cure to cancer. It's about finding the next breakthrough. And it's not something you can take from a lab and steal it and take it to China. So in that case, I think the United States needs to be a little more reasonable in terms of how to address the concerns. Clearly there's a concern. It should be addressed. But let's not make it a hysterical assertion that every Chinese research is a spy for the Chinese government.
Thank you so much, Neil. I don't know why a few years ago the idea of a co-evolution or G2 was brushed aside, allegedly by the Chinese. However, how to usher in an era of co-prosperity in the process of globalization remains a major issue on the agenda for both governments, despite the current hostile attitudes by Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, so on and so forth, John Bolton, by the way.
Yes.
We need to take a second look at why former and late President George W. Bush decided to send General Scowcroft to China at the most difficult moment in the late 1980s. And I believe Neil plays exactly the role of being a friendly ambassador at a difficult moment. He certainly comes under huge pressure from the U.S. side, but we really appreciate the decency of his job to engage China. I thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.